to the latest episode of the AI Adoption Playbook. I have Spencer from Shopify here with me. Do you want to introduce yourself, Spencer?
Sure. I'm Spencer. I work at Shopify and I lead data and ML teams.
Cool. Awesome. So let's just get straight into it since we've already been kind of been chatting. Tell me a little bit about, Shopify's work in the generative AI space. What are the things that you guys have done that you're really excited about that you feel like have gone really well?
Yeah, absolutely. So Shopify has been working on generative AI for a while, at least when it comes to applied use cases. So I remember some years ago, even before ChatGPT, we worked on, remember text expansion was the big use case. You do bullet points for an email, put it in the OpenAI playground, and then it would expand into a full email.
Really cool.
And then you sort of do the reverse, like, okay, take this email now, put it into bullet points. So we did some work on that, tested it with support advisors. So we have, Shopify's e-commerce, lots and lots of merchants. We have a strong support motion,
Really
customer support. And so we're looking for ways to make them more efficient. And we started with this kind of like toy use case. That evolved, obviously, especially as the technology got better and better. I think one of the core use cases that is live in production today is something called the Help Center Assistant. So if you have a Shopify store, or you just go on our Help Center, you can actually chat with an assistant, and it can analyzes all the Help Center articles and things like that. And it's quite efficient, mostly more so than talking to a human being for many use cases.
Makes sense, yeah.
So we have that use case, and then the way that we're expanding that is with something called Sidekick. So if you look that up, our CEO Toby has some videos and things on it. But the idea here is, how do we help merchants grow their business? How do we help them grow their stores through a similar interface?
Yeah.
Why are my orders trending down? What could I do for that? And ultimately giving it the ability to take actions on the store and help merchants build their business. So it's all very, what I would say, pursuing the cutting edge, and yet very mission aligned.
Awesome. Yeah.
We never deviate from make commerce better for everyone, help merchants grow their businesses, help drive more GMV. And all these other tools merely service that. And it really, you can see it play out in what we build and ship.
Yeah, I mean, that's awesome. I do think that there's like a little bit of a tendency in the AI industry for folks to just like shoehorn like some AI feature into their product, right? And then people are like, wait, why is this here? But like, obviously all the stuff that you're thinking about, it's basically just doing Shopify, but like more effectively with the like latest version of the technology that's available.
Yeah, I mean, we can totally get into the wide world of terrible chatbots. Hobby of mine to go. I just talk to them and see how I can break them.
What's your least favorite chatbot?
I'm not going to name it, but there was one I saw. It was like the company sold like underwear or something. It was like some sort of like trendy clothing store, and I was talking to it. It's kind of ridiculous, and I'm like, oh, I've been feeling really down lately. And it was like, well, you know what would cheer you up? A new pair of these boxer briefs that we just put on sale. I'm like, come on, man.
That's incredible.
So anyway, I like to test the limits of all these chatbots and see where we can go.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, probably that tone of voice thing is actually something that comes up quite a lot for us. I think in our sort of early days, one of the most common use cases would be these sort of chatbots that sit on top of people's HR knowledge bases, right? And turns out that people can ask HR like very sensitive questions, right? Like someone in my family just died, like how do I claim bereavement leave, that kind of thing. And if you get the tone of voice wrong for that, like it can actually be quite offensive to an employee. And so I think actually one of our very first leads ever came into us because they built this like internal thing. It had sort of gone awry in this like very sensitive case, and they were like, hey, how do we get like governance and compliance and like risk management on top of this stuff that's like actually more sensitive than we thought in the early days?
So how do you think that'll change as expectations evolve?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think one of the things that's sort of interesting is that the things that GRC teams, governance, risk, and compliance teams are actually worried about is this like moving target. Because in the early days, everything was just hallucination. And, you gave the example of like a customer support bot. If your customer support bot is like, yeah, sure, we'll refund you like $1 million, like that's a huge GRC like concern. And we saw this like early examples of the airlines. I don't remember if you remember this, but there was like an airline that accidentally promised like some
Yes.
customer like a huge refund, and they actually legally had to honor it. So that was the early days. And gradually, like I think the foundation models have improved a lot. And also like the engineering around it has improved a lot
Mm.
so that you can, I mean, I don't think you can completely eliminate the possibility of hallucination, but you can certainly manage the risk like a lot better today.
Yeah.
But now, obviously, there is this whole system of like action taking and like agentic AI, like doing stuff in your systems. And even if in theory you are making the right decision, especially if you're a regulated organization, you need to be able to justify those decisions, and you need to be
Mhm.
able to go back to the regulator, and you need to be able to say, like, okay, like, here's what we did, here's why. And the question of like why is pretty complicated when it's an AI system versus a human, right? Because a human can explain their decisions. Now, in theory, you can ask an AI to explain their decisions, but the link between an AI's explanation of its decisions and like whether it is the actual reason is like very ambiguous, right? Is that,
Yeah.
how do you interpret an AI's explanation of its own
They're often
behavior?
just backfilling and playing a confidence game.
Exactly, exactly. And obviously the regulators themselves have not like figured out their opinions on this. And so, we see a lot of like GRC folks, especially in the regulated space, being like very, very concerned about how do you get like AI systems to like be defensible, is what I would say.
Mhm.
At the end of the day, like you can't ever truly eliminate risk in, a human
Right.
system or a computer system. But what you do need to do is you need to be able to defend the system to the regulator.
Right.
And that I think is, as we said, like a very moving target as the foundation model capabilities improve and the sort of best practices on the engineering side are discovered as well.
Do you think that's any more complicated than keeping humans in the loop?
I do think it is more complicated than keeping humans in the loop. Yeah. And the reason that I say that is because there's actually just a ton of stuff where it doesn't actually need a human in the loop. To give you a really simple example, right? Like let's say you have an agentic system that sometimes needs to retrieve data and sometimes need to like, update some document.
Mhm.
Sometimes it needs to send an email. Understanding like the risk profile of each of those actions is like fairly important here where, okay, if you're retrieving information, as long as you're hitting the requirements that the information retrieved is like actually legitimately accessible to the person that is getting it, like you don't actually have to worry too much about should I go back to the human and ask them for approval to like read
Right.
this Google Doc. That's actually just more annoying than it is useful. On the other hand, like let's say you're sending an email, there's still like some cases where sending an email should probably not require human approval, right? If you're sending
Right.
an email to your own team, then that's pretty chill. If you're sending an email to your own team, but it's about like, the big company restructuring, that probably should actually get human
Mhm.
approval. And then if you're emailing a customer, then, most of the time you probably are going to want human approval there.
Right.
So just like mapping out all of the different scenarios and like figuring out, okay, when do I actually want human approval? Who is the human to approve this, right? Because it's not always the requester, right? If the requester's like, hey, add me to Snowflake as a DB admin, well,
Yeah.
maybe you want the user to approve that, but obviously realistically, it's a bit more complex than that. Okay, but maybe you can reduce all of that stuff down to like, is the right human making the right decision at the end of the day? But actually, it just turns out that there's a lot of complexity in that is hidden behind like keeping a human in the loop.
Yeah, that makes sense. And what we've implemented successfully at Shopify in many cases is actually LLM judges. So what we do is we'll have some kind of output. We have human annotators review. Then we have a rubric that they review, and then we also create an LLM judge that assesses on the same rubric.
Nice.
And you essentially just calibrate it until your LLM judge is indistinguishable from
Mm,
a human. And this is kind of how you enable more rapid iterations
yeah,
beyond what you can do with annotators in-house or outsource, and
100%.
sort of build that competency. And then you can scale that out to many different types of reviewers, many different use cases. And it's a way to iterate more quickly
Really nice. Yeah.
and achieve some of these.
And how does that like feedback process work for you guys? Is it primarily like thumbs up, thumbs down? Is there more to it than that? Like, how do you actually go about implementing?
Yeah, so we'll do a pretty rigorous rubric on, let's say we're doing email generation. You mentioned that. So this is an interesting one for us. We've created a rubric, and we have several LLM judges, but we'll do things like Easy one is general impression. What's the general impression of the email?
Yep.
Clarity, we'll do relevance, personalization,
Yep.
correctness, safety, and we'll have quite a few different categories ranging from sort of hallucinations, maybe like preventing obviously dangerous behavior to just like what's the quality of
Right.
this email.
Right.
And we'll do a 1 through 5
Cool.
scale. So we can get pretty rigorous metrics on
Mm.
these.
Nice. And so let's say the LLM judge comes back, says this is a 4. Do you still have a human like somewhere reviewing that, maybe asynchronously, being like, okay, this 4 was actually a 4, but this one should probably have been a 2? Or
Well, we actually have them review independently in parallel.
cool. Really cool.
And then as they're reviewing, we calibrate the judge accordingly. So we
And
always
how does that calibration process work?
so we have the humans input reasons and rationale for
Cool.
their ratings.
Yep.
And actually the humans themselves need calibrating because sometimes they
Makes
sort of
sense.
diverge and they're too strict or they're not thinking about the problem the right way.
Right.
So like the core is the human annotators and they're constantly reviewing, providing context. We also do things like inter-annotator agreements. We have multiple annotators doing the same subject
Oh, interesting.
example. So we see, okay, are they agreeing?
Makes
And
sense.
then we use that and literally just tune this LLM judge, not fine tune it, but we prompt engineer and do
Right,
fast
right.
iteration cycles there.
Really, really cool. Super, super interesting. And then one of the things that I'm curious about is like, that's obviously a pretty sophisticated system. It makes sense in the context of Shopify. Like, obviously, you guys have a lot of exceptionally talented engineers to like build these kinds of things. How do you think about building this tooling in house? Presumably, yeah, as you know, there's like a million and one at this point, like AI evals companies that
Right.
are doing like evaluations and workflows for evaluations, that kind of thing. How do you think about the build versus buy problem there?
Just start with a spreadsheet.
Cool.
Honestly,
Really?
just like rip and run on a spreadsheet and go for it. I'm sure like there are lots of good eval companies.
Yep.
They make it very easy, I'm sure, but you can get a long way just doing 50 to 100 samples at a time, running them through your annotators, or even the ML engineer, if they have time, they should be looking at each thing and dog fooding this product.
Yeah.
And then just tuning it again. I don't think very sophisticated eval software is needed for basic use cases. I'm sure you graduate at some point, but start with the spreadsheet always.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And do you guys view the like content here, the eval story, the human annotations, all of that stuff? Do you guys view that as part of the like production software like lifecycle process? Do you check it into version control? Do you have like deployment processes around that? Or is it actually just like, people can kind of go ham and like do things as fast as possible?
So we do emphasize speed, and what we'll do is early iterations, we're fine to do those offline
Really cool.
and just work very, very quickly. Infra and tooling are always in a state of getting better. So,
Makes sense.
there's always gaps, but we will move fast initially and get as many iteration cycles under our belts. And we do 1 week sprints across
nice.
all of our work. And then eventually do graduate to a more production system as you see stability in the outputs.
That's cool. It's interesting to me that Shopify operates on 1 week sprints. I feel like for an enterprise of your size, that's like a very tight like iteration cycle.
Yeah, we aim to ship weekly 1-2 week sprints and like very tightly scoped projects.
Really
Yeah.
cool. Yeah, really awesome. It's good to hear that as you scale from startup to like, huge enterprise, you can still maintain that speed of velocity. I feel like, there's a certain degree of cynicism that there's inevitability around like pace slowing. And obviously as a startup founder, I like really want to fight that like sense of inevitability. We're obviously still very early in our journey, but I want to be at Creedle for like 20 years, right? So I don't want it to slow down. I don't want the pace to be less cool 20 years from now than it is today.
Yeah, and I'll tell you where people lose that is quarterly check-ins,
Right.
biannual check-ins. How's the roadmap going?
Right.
We talk about our projects and our work every week. I'm having multiple conversations with my leads every week about the work, and being obsessed with those details is the real key.
Really cool.
I look at every project, all the details, minimum deep dive once a month to make sure everything is aligned to the aim, unblock all the ICs, we call them crafters,
Nice.
and like, just being obsessed with those details at the like the most minute level is super important. And I'll even comment on like column types
Really cool.
for a data
Really
model
cool.
that we're building, just because we're all sort of contributing to make this thing better, and being in
Right.
those details helps. So that's how we're able to actually move quicker, even though we're looking at these tiny levels of detail.
Really, really cool. Yeah, I feel like this is definitely something I've learned about how great organizations operate. So I joined Palantir in 2015. I was there for about 8 years. I think at the end of my first year, I wrote like a reflection doc on my like first year at Palantir. And one of the things that was in that reflection doc was a post about how I thought we were missing the boat on AI. Like at the time, Palantir had this like very strong, like we don't do AI kind of
Mm.
mindset. And I wrote like a little passage on that and how I thought it was a mistake. And one of the things that was like, I published it to a few of my friends, and a few of my friends like shared it with a few of their friends. And then I think it was one day after I like first shared it, I got this call from this California number, and I ignored it because I was like, don't know who this is. And then I got like 27 Slack messages simultaneously. I can't remember if it was Slack or if at that point we were on HipChat. It's possible we were on HipChat at the time. But 27 IMs being like, Stefan wants to talk to you. Stefan is like one of the founders of Palantir. He like read this thing and he has some questions for you on like how you think about the ML strategy. And I was just like, what? You know, I was like a kid basically at the time. I was like 25 years old, and I had no idea what I was doing. But the idea that I just like written a document, the founder of the company had read it, thought it was interesting, and was like motivated enough to like actually get to the bottom of what I was saying,
Mhm.
that he would like pick up his phone and like call me and speak to me directly. That was like a mind-blowing moment for me because, you know, it changed my perception of how companies could operate quite dramatically.
Yeah, and not to mention being willing to change your mind, be open
Right.
to
Right.
someone who's like pretty junior at the
Right.
time, and sort of take that as a learning moment.
Right.
That's key as well. At Shopify, we all have super strong opinions. Leadership is very technical, and we do get into the details and we push on things. But I mean, one of the great things, we're always willing to be wrong. It's not a big deal. We're trying to get to the bottom of it. So I
Yeah.
think that's another key.
Yeah, it's super true. I've been speaking to a lot of founders about, or yeah, a lot of other founders about hiring recently. And one of the things that has been super interesting is that I think there is a meme among founders that mostly comes from VCs, I think, but I'm not sure exactly where it comes from. That you have to hire, everyone has to be like 5 years plus experience from a great software engineering organization. And you don't want juniors, you don't want young people, like those folks all going to ship like terrible quality PRs, and they're going to ruin
Right.
everything. And I was sort of reflecting on that. I think I had inadvertently just absorbed this meme, and I was kind of like enacting it in our hiring policy without like sufficient first principles thinking. And at some point, I was like, I wonder how true this was of Palantir, right? Like, Palantir's a great company. They built like an awesome organization. I know a lot of people there. Like, did they all have 4 or 5 years experience from these like great engineering organizations? So I went through like basically all of the like most successful people I knew there, all the way from the founders down to like, you know, my direct managers and people I worked with who were great. And not a single person met that criteria,
Yeah.
not one. Um, and it was just like absolutely shocking to me. I had this idea that like, oh, the Palantir founders were all like 10 years experience at PayPal or whatever before. And they weren't actually, they were kids. Like maybe they'd spent a year or two at PayPal. And then they got into Palantir. Peter Thiel was really the only person that was like truly, you know, a very experienced operator at that point. And he wasn't even that involved in Palantir's business. So it was just nuts to see how at odds the sort of vibe is. And then like the scary thing was that I kind of realized that when you as a founder signal to your employees that the only thing you care about in the hiring process is that someone has like 5 years of experience at this like fancy engineering org, you're basically telling them that you care about authority more than like the quality of their ideas. And that actually is like super counterproductive. It destroys the exact thing that you're talking about of like, you know, do people actually feel like they can learn from folks who are younger, folks who
Mhm.
don't necessarily have much experience, but have a lot of passion and energy and belief and like care a lot about getting it right. So
Yeah, well, that's an interesting story because I mean, the assumption started off wrong, which is, oh, they're
right,
gonna ship bad PRs, and
right,
therefore that's bad because
right.
what? we want good PR. It's like, okay, I don't think that's exactly what
Right,
like
right,
a good company. It's sort of
right,
necessary at some point, but
right.
you need definitely other traits, and that's what we look for in hiring too. High ownership. Can
So
you
true.
take a problem and really run with it? Can you speak to all different types of roles and sort of put on different hats?
Yep.
I think that's what we definitely focus on, and you can miss out if you're looking for the wrong things in resumes.
Totally makes sense. I'm curious if like the AI stuff has affected your like hiring processes at all. I mean, obviously there's like the question of how do people interview? Do you let people use AI in interviews, that kind of stuff? But I'm also curious if it changes in any way the profile of engineer that you look for.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't think we're to the point where engineering skills are not needed anymore.
Right,
Obviously,
right,
like,
right.
it's very valuable to be a strong engineer, and
Yep.
like even more so in the
100%
world of
right.
AI. We look for people who are interested in it,
Right.
and
Right.
honestly, not everyone is.
Yeah.
That's
So true.
okay, but I think this is my belief. If you're interested in something, you're going to be 10 times better at it than if you're not interested and you have some sort of baseline competency. You're good at
Right.
it. That intersection of like, I'm good at this thing and I'm very interested, that's going to propel people.
So true.
So we always look for that. And we ask, even internally, we ask our employees often, like, how are you using AI? What is it doing for you? And these things. And we really look for those people who are passionate about it. And more junior people will build things that are incredible that even sort of like more senior engineers
Right.
are
Right.
not. So, especially in this era where you can go from zero to a prototype very fast,
Yeah.
that passion is critical.
Yeah.
Like to be sincerely
100%.
interested in it. Are you reading about it? Are you trying things? Are you actually doing the rounds with cursor and like actually trying to build things? That's important. We're always looking for builders, and that's the
Yeah.
right mindset with AI for sure, especially given all the great tools that are out there.
Yeah, that makes sense. Are you guys on one of the Cursor, Windsurf, Copilot bandwagons at this point? Are you
Yeah, we use cursor.
cool?
That's primary workhorse for most people.
Really
But it's
cool.
interesting because not everybody will. I mean, again, this is a difference of personality, but
Right.
I've talked to people and I've said, we're talking about cursor. Oh, it's really great. And they'll be like, I don't think so. I don't think it's any better than copying and pasting out of Claude. I'm like, okay.
Wow. Gosh, interesting.
Yeah, see you later, I guess. I don't
Yeah, I find some of this stuff pretty baffling. I do like to ask people what their like graveyard of projects is. Like, what are the things that they tried that didn't work? Because in a way, it gives you a little bit of a mindset of like how hard are they trying to like push the
Mhm.
envelope. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
One of the things that's always interesting is like discovering the graveyard projects that didn't work last year because like the models weren't there or like some part of
Right.
the ecosystem wasn't there. But all of a sudden, the ecosystem and the models are moving so fast that like you can reinvent the graveyard projects.
Absolutely.
Cool. One of the things that I always like to talk to folks about is what are the organizational challenges of actually getting stuff done? Right. Look, obviously AI is generative AI at least is like a pretty new technology in the context of the enterprise. You said you guys have been using it for a long time, right, at the beginning of the podcast, but then you said like 2022, right?
Right.
Which like in the
Yeah.
context of enterprise technology is like really
Yep.
still pretty new. I'm sure there are a lot of challenges working with legal, infosec, compliance, because it's such a new technology and it's a very technical org. There's a lot of people with opinions about how it should be done.
Mhm.
How do you actually go about shepherding the cats or herding the cats, I guess, into figuring out what is the strategy that we can actually execute on and like, starting to make real progress?
Yeah, I think there are a couple elements. So, like, number one, having a vision set out. So, our CEO, Toby, sets a very strong vision for, hey, AI is very important to us.
Really
This
cool.
is the future. This is something everyone needs to think about
Really cool.
every day.
Really
And so, starting there and having that as a company wide focus really
Yeah.
matters. And then, okay, we're trying to build things, and I'll use the email example again.
Yep.
We want to send emails, we want to do personalized emails at
Yep.
scale, and we need to work with, let's say, the legal team
Yep.
who does review of marketing templates,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
Well, this is very different than what they're used to because they're
Right.
used to, hey, this template, their variables, it's going to go out to 10,000 people. Can you review
Right.
the template? Sure, I'll review the template.
Right.
No. And we come to the table, we're like, hey, here's this email, like we're generating these. What do you think about this? No, they're all kind of a little bit different. It's not just a template. So the key there is really educating people.
Brilliant.
Like, here's what we're doing, understanding what their key objectives are, what do they want to
Yeah.
ensure in terms of like safety, brand guidelines, et cetera.
Yep.
And then sort of co-creating whatever product it is and making
Right.
sure that it meets the requirements that they have in their mind. Things like, on our chatbots, like disclosing that it's AI. It's pretty
Right.
base, right? But people
Right.
do need to be on board for that.
Yeah.
And there are some people who start out with like, well, it should never be wrong.
Right.
And you have to explain, well, it can be wrong. there's no
Right.
way it can never be wrong, much like
Right.
a person can never
100%.
be wrong. Like,
100%.
so anyway, I think it's, top-down vision, lots of educating. And then the other piece organizationally is just execution speed. We talked about that
Yeah.
a little bit. How do you move quickly, do 1 to 2 week sprints, ship things, test with users, get the right eval in place? That is critical as well because things are moving so fast. You have to actually ship things. There's no world of like, okay, this is what we're going to build over the next 6 months.
Totally makes sense. Yeah. Well, one of the things that I'm curious about, because I feel like I see a lot of divergence in our customers on this, is like taking a deductive versus inductive approach to figuring out what to build. So what I mean by that is like, especially in contexts where you've got like a big AI champion right at the top of the organization, you see a lot of places whose philosophy here is essentially like, let's let everybody experiment. Maybe we even give everybody like an AI budget or something and like see what happens and inductively figure out like what's valuable and scale those things versus the opposite approach, which is essentially let's sit down, figure out what are our biggest business problems, what are the 3 things that, our organization needs to do to like hit our like revenue goals or, whatever it is, goals for the end of the year, and then figure out how to slot AI into those processes.
Right. The way I position this with my teams is pretty simple, actually. So you've heard of like a barbell strategy
Yep.
before, but for us, the barbell in AI is on the one end, sort of lifting all boats, lots of small use cases. There's value there, but it's not super high value. It's sort of
Right.
like table stakes. And this is what you talked about earlier, which is how do we automate repetitive tasks? How do
Yep.
can you revise my Slack message? Can you
Yep.
draft this email? Can you make this process a little bit easier for me because I spend an hour a week on it? These
Yep.
things. So I would call these sort of like smaller, piecemeal, yet still valuable use cases. And then there are bigger bets. These are larger, talking full scale automation, multimodal. How do we make a step change in the business? This is the other side.
Yeah.
And the way we think about that is how do we enable people to self-serve on
Yep.
this lower end, which is why we're talking to you all.
Yep.
And then how do we make the right investments that are durable
Yeah.
in the bigger bets for us?
100%.
So yeah, that's the approach. And then where people get lost is in the middle.
Yeah.
In the middle is, lots of engineering investment to do something that's more or less trivial that comes out of the box with like
Right.
ChatGPT or an in-house implementation.
Right. Yeah. That makes so much sense. And I think it's really tricky because people are obviously very passionate about building with this stuff, but there's a lot of potential projects in that like middle graveyard.
Mhm.
And then the next thing you know, you've got like a 10-person engineering team staffed on maintaining a bunch of tooling that is not that valuable.
Right.
And comes, as you say, out of the box with a bunch of stuff. So
Yeah. And so back to your question of investment, it's important to let people experiment a lot.
yeah.
And I would recommend anybody do that because that enables people to understand what's possible.
Yeah.
The problem with deductive, say, hey, what are our big business priorities? How does AI fit in those?
Yeah.
Is because many people don't intuit how AI can sort of add value to a particular business problem. And they often, to no fault of their own, just sort of write it off.
Right.
Oh, that thing, AI could never do that.
Right.
We have a joke, which is, if we want to figure out what to build, we just go around and ask everybody what AI can't do. And that's our thing.
Love it. That's actually very good.
Because anytime I ask someone that or they sort of make a comment, you talked about this earlier, someone told me, oh, AI doesn't have emotional intelligence.
Right.
It'll never have that. I'm like, actually, yeah, it does. Like really well, actually. So
Very true.
you have to enable both sides of it in order to sort of tackle these. Like just picking out your biggest business problems and trying to throw AI at them is probably not going to work. But
Yep.
even then, again, we sort of enable the low end and sort of we pick our bets. We do try to quantify everything.
Yeah.
And this is something that I think is important. Your bar for how serious the quantification and how reliable it needs to
Right.
be is sort of going to follow your actual investment of like
Makes
engineering.
sense.
But this is a tricky one as well. And this is where things like time savings can sort of go awry.
Yeah. Do you have your own internal framework beyond just like asking people how much time they saved for like how to measure the ROI on this stuff?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we understand all the levers of our business.
Cool.
So how does Shopify help merchants succeed?
Yep.
How does Shopify help itself succeed in
Yep.
terms of how do we bring new merchants on? How do we sort of cross sell them? We understand what levers to pull, how far they can be pulled, what kind of lift we can see. And we have a framework for impact in all these areas.
Cool.
And it varies by org. But then there are things like time savings.
Yeah. Makes sense. Yeah.
Which again is not super reliable. I think the thing people forget with time savings is, you're essentially talking about an opportunity cost. Well, that has to be filled with something
Exactly.
else, not,
Exactly.
I sometimes worry that we're saving people a bunch of time, which they then go spend on YouTube shorts or
Right.
something,
Right.
sort of
Right.
like scrolling, as opposed to, it's implied that they're going to go do something more productive at
Right.
that time. And that's something you have to keep in mind.
Yeah, 100%. One of the things that you said that was interesting to me was like figuring out how you like give license to experiment. I think that's exactly right. One of the things that we've seen often go wrong with license to experiment is that companies want to give their employees leeway to experiment, as you said, for all the reasons that you said. But then because they want that leeway to experiment, they're very hesitant about rolling out policies about what people can and can't do with AI because they're
Right.
like, we want people to experiment. The challenge is that when you don't have a clear policy, the employees are like, well, am I going to get in trouble if I do this? Like, is someone going to see me as lazy? Is someone going to like say I'm breaching our like infosec policies? And then in a weird way, it can be like counterproductive where you don't have a policy because you think it will create more experimentation, but actually uncertainty means that people don't want to do anything at all because they're nervous. Like, how have you guys approached that?
Yeah, so we have a policy in place. I think it's pretty good. I'm sure it answers 80 to 90% of people's questions.
Yeah.
And then, I mentioned chatting with legal teams and
Yeah.
procurement teams and things like that. They're all very accessible, and
Cool.
we're a fully remote company, so we have a strong internal communication framework, or just the pathways are very clear. So yeah, it is a combination of a policy. You can put this type of information here, but not this kind of
Yep.
information. We make that available and accessible in our docs, and then there's always room for people to ask questions.
Totally makes sense. Do you guys have any kind of mechanism, or do you have initiatives to try and enforce those policies automatically through software? Or do you just view it as like, we trust our employees, they're great people, like they'll be responsible once we issue the policy?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we do both parts of it. We do operate in a high trust environment,
Yep.
yet there are checks. Like, for example, even if something as simple as you can't just download any piece of software
Right,
on
right, right,
your
right.
computer. It has to be approved, and those approvals have to go through a rigorous process,
Yep.
like security review and things like that, which might be normal for some, but some companies you actually can just like download any Chrome extension.
Right.
Like, we don't do that. So we do tighten up there. We do have like other automation in place to check, but then there is a layer of like, okay, let's sort of trust people.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. I think in the early days, I feel like I saw a lot of folks trying to block like everything, block this AI app, block that
Right.
AI app. And the problem is, firstly, there's just too many, and
Yep.
the list is changing so fast. And then secondly, people will get around these things, right?
Right.
And it's a weird scenario where the set of people that don't care enough to get around your rules are the exact set of people who you should have cared about trying to block, and the set of people that are responsible enough to follow the rules are the set of people that you probably didn't need to block anyway.
Yeah.
And so there's like some irony in that.
One thing I just thought of, kind of going back to an earlier topic,
Yeah.
talking about value and so what is going to happen with all this. I think there's one version of an AI future where jobs are automated.
Yep.
And I sort of roll in, and now I work 2 hours a day instead of 8 hours a day because of all these AI tools and
Right.
things like that. It's post economics,
Right. Right.
all this stuff. I actually don't think that's going to happen. And I think a different theory that I've been thinking about recently is I think the bar is just going to get much higher for everybody. I think you're going to be expected to do more.
Interesting.
Easy examples like a salesperson has a quota. I think that quota is going to go up.
Yeah, for sure. Right. For
So,
sure.
this concept we were just talking about time savings. Well, what are you doing at that time? Well, I don't know, but I'm going to raise the bar because I know how long it takes you
Right.
to do your
Right.
job now.
Right.
So I think we'll see that sort of play out
Really
over
cool.
time in terms of yes, time savings, but how are we able to raise the bar for everybody
Right.
across the disciplines? Could be engineers, data,
Right.
could be salespeople, like anybody. How do we consistently raise that? Because we know all these tools are available, much like, okay, now we have Excel. I know you're not writing all these things by hand and
Right.
spending hours a day calculating, right?
Right.
Showing formula. I think it'll be the same thing. I think productivity expectations will increase significantly.
That makes a ton of sense. Like, do you guys tie that to AI adoption? Do you actually say things like, hey, you want to buy this, like, $1 million a year AI tool, you better up your quota by like $2 million a year if you want to justify that?
Yeah, so we're not doing that kind of thing right now. We do quantify everything. So if we were going to buy a piece of software for $1 million, we
Right.
would need to see pretty concrete information.
Makes sense.
And it probably, that level of spend would have to go beyond just like, a pinky swear that we're saving time, like
Right,
this
right,
kind of
right.
thing. So we want to
Right.
see real metric lift and
Yeah.
A/B testing and things like that. But no, we're not quite to the point where sort of expectations and quotas are getting higher. But
Yeah.
I think that could be on the rise for many companies.
Yeah, that makes sense. I do think sooner or later that has to be inevitable for, like, because AI is expensive. Like, a lot of these tools, like, the asking price is like non-trivial, right?
Right.
OpenAI starts selling these like $2,000 a month, like PhD level agents. You're going to need some level of, okay, you can get this, but what are you giving us back to the business in return? And I think we're still in the early innings of figuring out, like, empirically, like, what actually works for doing that.
Yeah. And I think we'll see it play out in a couple different ways. Another one that I suspect, and I think this has been happening in the industry, but something as simple as manager wingspans, how many people can you manage, I think
Super
is going to
interesting.
increase. In a
Super
pre-AI
interesting.
world, 6 to 8, depending on your function.
Super interesting.
Well, if you have this sort of suite of AI tools, and like, for example, the other day I sort of downloaded all my feedback on various projects, so we can
Right.
capture all that, and I
Makes
write
sense.
it in our system, and I sort of downloaded that, and I did some prompt iterations, and I made just a little bot, and I
Really
told my
cool.
team, I'm like, hey, use this
Nice.
before you come to me for feedback, because this is going to do 95% of it.
Right.
Okay, great. Now I have more capacity, and so
Really,
other managers out there, okay, you were doing 6 to 8 before. Why can't you have 15
really cool. Yeah.
directs now? So like, that's another way that expectations I think will increase. In addition to the easy ones to think about, like sales rep quotas.
Yeah, 100%. We actually have a customer checker who their entire, like, feedback process, I think they do it 6 monthly. Every single person at the company has access to this, like, Creedle built, like, feedback bot.
Mhm.
And every single manager also has access to, like, a slightly, the managerial version, right?
Right.
And it helps them craft, synthesize, like, and explain sort of and understand the feedback that they've gotten from their customers in a way, so from their peers in a way that's like, meaningful to them, but also consistent with the way that Checker as an organization thinks about doing feedback and evaluating people and that kind of stuff.
Mhm.
And then from a manager's perspective, especially for new managers, I think just like being able to calibrate and understand, like, okay, like, what does this person's feedback look like compared to,
Mhm.
the 1,000 other people at Checker? Like, where are the areas where they do stand out as really strong? And one of the things that's also been really interesting for them is at an organizational level that gives them the data analytics on where a manager's feedback to a person is inconsistent with their peers,
Mhm.
right? Because that's like there's always something interesting going on there. And it's hard to
Right.
tell just from the facts that there's inconsistency, like why that is. But usually there's something interesting to figure out. Maybe it's the relationship, maybe it's like something else, but
Mhm.
lots of like interesting things to discover. And as you said, it takes this process that everyone kind of hates doing, like the end of year performance cycle, makes it like much lower lift, much higher fidelity for both the employee and employer, and actually creates this like compounding effect for the organization as a whole.
Yeah, definitely. Talent
Right.
management, talent development is a huge area where AI will make a big impact.
Yeah, for sure. Exciting and sort of interesting to see. I think this is probably one of the first places where I imagine what we were talking about earlier, that sense that like the organization concretely feels different.
Yes.
Talent, I think, is actually one of the first places where that was
Yeah.
happen.
And I do think it's going to be a slow burn on productivity and sort of like it's going to, if it's not already there for most companies, it's going to be soon where different types of AI tooling are just essential.
Yep.
Like last time I checked, nobody is saying, "Hey, should we have Salesforce or should we have spreadsheets like Excel? Let's A/B test it to see if it
Right.
adds value." It's like, okay, you need a CRM,
Right.
you need
Right.
Docs, obviously. So I do see AI tooling going in that direction,
Yeah.
and then the productivity is going to go up, and the expectations will be higher.
What do you make of the Klarna stuff? Like Klarna, I don't know if you saw this, but they scrapped Salesforce and
Yeah.
they announced that they had replaced Salesforce with a internally built like AI vibe coded
Uh-huh.
solution to replace Salesforce. And I forget what the cost savings were, but it was at least on paper like absolutely phenomenal because Salesforce obviously expensive piece of software.
Yeah, I don't know the details of that one, but
Right.
like companies are, especially as they get a little bit larger, they're always kind of, could we build this in house? Like it has a
Right.
lot of
Right.
problems. Can we build our own? I have heard of companies trying to build their own CRM
Right.
to varying degrees of success. I didn't, if it works for them, great. I don't know a ton about. I think there's a lot of like non AI work in CRMs. It's pretty challenging stuff.
Yeah, I do totally agree for that. For now, I mean, I suppose as the models continue to improve, we'll have to reevaluate that. It is interesting. It is interesting. I think there is going to be some level of reckoning for these like SaaS providers that have built tremendous moats around essentially like having a lot of code.
Mm.
And, it's certainly not going to become like trivial to replicate Salesforce in the near future, but the cost and benefits of like trying to build custom software, whether it's for your CRM or for like any other internal tooling, yeah, it'll be interesting to see how that plays out.
Yeah, definitely. I don't suspect we're very far from a world where you can say to the effect of like, give me a lightweight version of Salesforce,
Right,
or even
right,
input a spec and have it build. So, there's some good AI coding agents out there that do
right.
that type of thing, and they're okay. They mostly build like living mock-ups now,
Yeah.
but I think we can't be too far.
I think that's right. I think the thing that feels off about the like implication of that, of being like, okay, well, like Salesforce must be doomed, is that if I look at the ecosystem of SaaS providers today, like how many of them have some integration with Salesforce? Well, if you sell to GTM teams, then it's 100%, right?
Right.
Yeah, it's easy maybe to get like Claude to write a lightweight version of Salesforce. It's difficult to get Claude to write a lightweight version of Gong and,
Right.
Demand Base and like the 2000 other like SaaS tools in your like GTM stack.
Yeah, I agree. It all depends on the company too. I think if you can get by with a super lightweight CRM and not need
Right.
Salesforce, well, maybe you can just be in a spreadsheet.
Really
Like a lot
cool.
of smaller companies run their CRMs out of spreadsheets.
Right.
Not great, but like, what do you actually need?
Right.
Larger companies, I mean, it'd be a while before you just like roll your own.
Right. Makes a ton of sense. Last few minutes. So last couple questions for you. The first one is like for you personally, in your day-to-day usage of AI and sort of experimentation with it, what are the things that you're actually most excited about it for your life? Like whether that's personal or at work, like what are the things where you think it's actually going to make a big difference to you?
To me, and has always excited me the most. So I don't care as much about the sort of task level, like writing and
Yeah.
things like that. I use it all the time for that. So I
Cool.
like many messages that I'm sending out, and
Right.
I'm often getting like feedback on that. That's all great. Not very
Awesome.
exciting. I see that as just table stakes.
Makes sense.
To me, where I found a ton of leverage is using it as a strategic thought partner.
Really cool. Really cool.
So even one of the first things I played around with, you mentioned like the graveyard.
Yeah.
You know, one was like I built a couple bots that would just like help me reason about things. So I built what I called like a steelman bot. And so if there was something I didn't agree with, I would put it in there and then it would tell me like all the reasons why it was a good idea or a good point of view.
Nice.
I had a similar like the other side of that is like a devil's advocate bot. I put my
Right.
thing in here to tell me all the reasons
That's
why.
cool.
You get like that. So to me, like thinking and what I'll do is I'll put, a dozen different books I like, and
Right.
then I'll use that for navigating strategic situations
Right.
in my life or in work, and using that. And many times it has good ideas, sometimes not, but it's a really interesting way to think better and think about my own ideas. And I can see the gaps and like, okay, well, I see why it's recommending that, but it's missing this piece of context that I have. But often it'll also give me actually really good novel ideas.
Right.
If I have two options in mind of how I want to handle a situation, it might give me a third option. So
Right.
I think like, to me, AI and LLMs have a huge upside in strategic thought partnership, teaching you to be a better thinker and see many different sides of issues, challenges,
Right.
strategic situations. I found it totally fascinating.
No,
I use it all the time.
I think that's really cool. I think one of the things that's interesting about this kind of use case is like it's obvious, I think, as you say, that like there's a lot of like upside here if you could get this. The challenge is that I think once you start getting it working, there's a danger that you experience the downside, which is that you become intellectually lazy because you've got
Mm,
this thing that's like really smart and does like 95% of the like work for you. And then you just don't no, it like looks good enough, right? And then you don't
right.
do the thinking to like figure out the last 5% and make sure that you've like fully absorbed the mental models. How do you think about managing that kind of like, that process in yourself of like, where is it good to become very reliant on these tools and like where actually do you want to maintain this sort of skill as well?
I can tell you how it works for me. I don't know how it would sort of scale out to everybody,
Right.
but I'm highly engaged in the process. Even if
Cool.
I'm having it sort of, let's say I don't know, I sent a message to my org recently, and
Mhm.
it's just one of these kind of longer messages, and I
Really cool.
sort of put it in there. I wrote it originally, got some feedback. Okay, well, I go back and forth with it, and I read it in detail,
Mm,
and I make sure that it's matching the tone and like
yeah.
sending the right message. Similarly, if I'm working on something more strategic, I never quite fully believe it.
Right.
I'm always aware of what I'm talking to, who I'm
Yeah.
talking to, that it doesn't have all the context because I know what I put in there and
Yeah.
what's
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
my head and just out in the world. So I definitely approach it with a healthy degree of skepticism.
Makes
I
sense.
suggest everyone do. And this is why also just like side note, I like I like AIs that don't have names of
Nice.
people. Like I just think it's the wrong impression. Yeah.
I love it.
Which is why I like Chat GPT name is perfect because it's just
Yeah.
it's not a name. So
Right.
anyway, I think like understanding who you're talking to, and I'm never very reliant on it. I never just send things that
Right.
it says, and I'm always sort of checking in and asking my own questions of it. So that's how I stay
Really
on
cool.
top of it.
Makes ton of sense. And then last question for you. This is a bit of a silly one, to be honest. When will AGI replace your job?
I'm working on it. I told you this feedback thing. I mean, I would love to see that. Like I think I think AI should replace every job. We should all have different jobs. Like I think about that often. Like how do
Really
I
cool.
replace myself? Even you mentioned feedback and sort of like impact assessments and sort of performance things. Like we collect tons of data on that. We do 360 reviews, and I put mine in, and it does like we have a system that does many of the same things you
Right.
described,
Right.
and you can see how like, oh, my job as a people manager is not going to be to summarize 360
Right.
feedback.
Right.
And
Right.
I love that because I don't want that to be my job or
Right.
anybody's job. I need to work on some other element where I add
Yeah.
value. And I
Yeah.
see myself and others like, if this is the spectrum of what you work on, there's always going to be something that's being scooped out of the bottom. And then you have
Yeah.
to reinvest it back where you actually add value.
Really cool.
And
Yeah.
over time, just constantly getting out the junk that is low yield. AI
Yeah.
is going to constantly creep up and then reinvesting in higher and higher orders of thinking, adding value to the company or whatever you're working on. So when will it? I totally dodged your question. As soon as possible, I truly like cross my fingers.
That's
Yeah,
amazing. Okay. Thank you very much.
bit by bit every day.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Spencer. And thanks everyone for tuning in.